room. Just to
Okay.
help me, all right?
Whenever you're ready.
All right. So hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm going to be talking about nuclear power today. So according to the World Nuclear Association, only 30 people died as a direct result of the Chernobyl disaster. And according to the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, apart from some increases in the occurrence of thyroid cancers, there's no discernible effect on health after the incident. So nuclear power obviously has a lot of controversy surrounding it. It generates a lot of power. It also generates some radioactive wastes and has quite high startup costs, as well as some safety concerns with the past two incidents. But nevertheless, nuclear power is the most advantageous source of power we have widely available today. First, I'm going to have to move on to some definitions to clear some things up. Then I can move on to talking about how clean nuclear power is, how much energy it generates, its costs, and then I can clear up those safety concerns. So nuclear power itself is using nuclear reactions to generate heat, which we use to create steam, which goes into a generator, which generates power. Something called the positive void coefficient is essentially steam bubbles that decrease reactivity in a reactor. They're really associated with RBMK reactors, which are Soviet-era reactors that are no longer made. So nuclear energy is actually pretty clean. It has no carbon emissions, no greenhouse gases, it's just water vapor. And the plants themselves are actually responsible for all the waste they produce. And the fuel that's used can actually be repurposed into other materials or more fuel, actually. And radioactive waste is only a small percentage of the total industrial waste produced by America. And low-level radioactive wastes can actually be produced, or can actually be put into regular landfills, which is the majority of radioactive waste. The rare high-level materials are usually buried in specially made underground structures that are built to last. Now on to the energy. According to the Department of Energy, nuclear power produces as much as 3.1 million average-sized PV solar panels, or about 430 utility-scale wind turbines. And according to the World Nuclear Association, a single average nuclear power plant can generate 44 million kilowatt hours from 1 ton of natural uranium. That's over 20,000 times the amount that 1 ton of coal can produce, which is at about 2,000 kilowatt hours per ton. And according to the Energy Information Administration, in 2016, a single reactor would be enough to power the standard American home for over 4,000 years. Now, the costs. Nobody's going to deny that nuclear power has some high startup costs for the production of the facilities. But in 2015, the National Energy Institute said that nuclear energy had the lowest operating costs, being in order to keep the plant running and producing power out of any other source of power. And there are always ways to help minimize the impact of those startup costs, subsidies or something else. Now I'm going to clear up the safety concerns. Chernobyl and Fukushima, while maybe not preventable, were definitely containable, more so than they were. According to Ms. Kadi in the Department of Civil Environmental Engineering at the University of South California, Japan relied too much on their utility company to accurately report the damage that had happened, and as a result, the government responded quite poorly, as the company had actually lied about the concerns. And Chernobyl, the reactor itself, when they created it, they cut a lot of corners. They had actually removed most of the control rods that they had for the reactor that would help stabilize it, and the ones they did have left were manual, which meant that you have to actually have someone realize there's a problem and then put the control rods in. And the positive void coefficient, while it decreases reactivity, they also had a graphite moderator, which let reactions continue and only built up heat. Beyond that, the control rods they did have actually jammed, which prevented them from being useful in any way. And the staff had very poor training and no safety culture whatsoever. Reactors that we have now have tons of safety mechanisms. The crew are trained, and there's a lot of oversight from officials that know what they're doing. So they're much, much safer. There's a lot of reactor problems that have happened, but we don't hear about them because they're contained and nobody gets hurt. So that's the reason why nuclear power is the most advantageous source of power that we have available today.
All right, Jonathan, I kind of knew what your proposition was, so I recognized it when it was in the introduction, but it was not as clear as it probably should be. At the end, though, you do come back and you kind of recap it and remind us what it is, and I think that helps a lot to focus everything that you've been talking about by the time you get to the end of the speech. The contents of the speech are previewed, but you do rush through those points, and it sounds like there are a lot of them. There are 4 points that you ultimately mentioned, plus you also had some definitional issues that you're sticking in there, and so that felt a little bit crammed, and you needed to maybe pace that out a little bit more at the beginning of the speech. You did signpost the first point on the cleanliness of nuclear power. However, this is the one place where I heard the least amount of information. That seemed to be, it just seemed to be an assumption. There's no, you've got an explanation, but there's no authority that says this. There's no citation of factual data on this particular point. I don't doubt that mostly what you're talking about is true, although I have heard that there are some elements of CO2 that are involved in the process. You make it sound like there's nothing there, and I'm not sure how accurate that is, but I certainly have no reason to believe it without some citation of information. So I think you need to have that in the presentation. On the other issues, on the cost issue, for instance, I thought that you did a good job talking about what the general productivity of nuclear power plants are. You made some comparisons, I think, put it into perspective in relationship to other energy resources. That was pretty good. You acknowledge that there is, in fact, a cost barrier that might be problematic, and I thought that you had some reasonable presses on that as a way of addressing the issue. It is the responsibility of the refutation speaker to deal with that issue more. You're just, in essence, trying to overcome any reticence that the audience might have in listening to what you're talking about. The safety issue, you primarily focus on debunking or showing that the 2 major disasters that happen are not something that is likely to happen with future technology, by talking about how Japan's response was so skewed by the utility company, and the government action in response was problematic. First of all, there's no evidence on this, and I think you could probably provide a citation on that, because I didn't think that you made that up. But you don't tell us where you got that information from. And second, there's not really much of an explanation about how different things might have been had we had any of the other things that are talked about later on, when you talk about our new technology and our training methodology, for instance. How that would overcome the tsunamis and that kind of thing. I'm not sure that really addresses that issue. The Chernobyl issue, it's like you basically say, this is a unique example that we shouldn't be reasoning from because of all these horrible things that they did. And again, I don't doubt that all those things are true, but you do want to give a source citation for the information. I thought that that was the main problem when it came to the evidence, is that you were inconsistent about citing the sources for information. There were examples, there was some statistical information, there were a couple places where you had some authoritative information. I did think you got sidetracked a little bit on giving us some technical jargon that wasn't particularly important for your argument, and the evidence and the information that you're citing is appropriate, but like I said, it's not really being cited very consistently. All right, and then at the end of the speech, as I said before, I thought that you did a nice job kind of recapping what the purpose of the argument was, and I thought that was clearer at the end. All right, thank you.